All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining me. I'm David Neff, and I am here today with Dr. Marc Pollack, and we are talking about GMOs and other topics. So, Dr. Pollack, please introduce yourself and welcome back to the channel.
Hi, thank you, David, for having me. I'm Dr. Marc Pollack. I just recently graduated with my PhD in microbiology. At least it seems recent. It was only a little over a year ago. My research focused on something called the satellite RNA, which is able to pirate things from a viral infection in plants. And so I got to learn a lot of facts about plants and how we use them in everyday society and why that matters. And so I'm here to have a discussion with David about that topic, especially GMOs.
Yeah, definitely. And there is a lot of disinformation and confusion out there about what GMOs are and what that even means. So I think we should start with what type of organisms, what type of crops are actually genetically modified, and what type of crops are on the market. Hey, Brainbug, good to see you.
So it can be a lot of different crops, but traditionally the biggest ones have been things like soybeans and corn and cotton, which have gotten large amount, uh, which are now most of the market for them is GMO. Part of the reason why that's so important in their cases is because we want to prevent a number of different infections of them by various plant pests and also insects attacking them. So there's a lot of things like BT corn, which produces a specific toxin that at a low enough level that it's not damaging to pretty much anyone else, but it can kill off plant pests that can do a lot of harm to those plants. So
All right.
there can be a lot of different plants that can take on GMO properties based on what we choose to have in them and where we think that is most important. But right now, those are the big ones.
All right. And how are GMOs made? You see these memes all the time on Facebook where mad scientists are taking a syringe from one crop and putting it into another. Obviously, that is all completely wrong. So, what techniques are there that to make these GMOs?
So the most common means to genetically modify a plant is using something called Agrobacterium tumefaciens. It's a major bacterial pest of plants, and it does something very specialized. It produces this plasmid, a circular piece of DNA called a TI plasmid or a tumor-inducing plasmid. And that tumor-inducing plasmid has a special region in it that will insert itself into the plant genome and start forcing that plant to produce lots and lots of cells at that site that basically become its home where it can actually survive and thrive. The beauty of it is we can actually hijack what it does with the TI plasmid for our own purposes. We can actually introduce a gene that's not the tumor inducing gene that will go into these plants and force them to produce something that we find is important. And for the most part, when you use it, you're just getting some transient expression. It's called epigenetic. It's outside of the genome, but if you continue the process enough and breed plants to see how well they hold on to that specific sequence, then you can find out if they are genetically modified and actually have that sequence in their genome.
All right. And so let's talk about some of the myths that we commonly see from organic pushers and fear people like the fear babe. So let's start with the number one is that foods with GMOs contain fewer nutrients.
So that's definitely not true. There's no indication based on any of the studies I've read that there's a reduced amount of nutrient content in any of these. In fact, in some food varieties, like one of the most well-known GMO foods out there is something called golden rice, which is meant to have a specific nutrient that doesn't exist in rice. If you live in a part of the world where your diet is mostly rice-based, then you might not get enough vitamin. I think it's vitamin B in your diet, and so this becomes a major source of vitamin B in the diet of the people who take it, eat it.
Right. So, myth number two is that consuming GMOs can somehow alter your DNA.
So this one is based in a misunderstanding of that genetic modification process. There are two problems with it. There are two different ways in which they express it, rather. One is that, like, agrobacterium is somehow going to get into your body and modify your cells. It's not really surviving past the point that it does these genetic modifications. It's not creating the home it needs for itself to survive in these plants. And even if it did, it can't affect your cells. It's just not meant to. It interacts with plant cells specifically. Humans don't have plant cells. Pretty straightforward. The other way that people talk about it is, oh, but you can also get these viruses replicating inside these plants as a result of this. And that's technically true. You can actually inject a sequence that will replicate as a virus in those plants and therefore produce a lot more of what you want in those plants, which is really cool and really effective. But again, those viruses are plant specific. They're going to cause harm to the plant. They're going to get in and force the plant to make what we want it to make, but they can't modify human cells.
All right. So, myth number three is that GMOs are inherently harmful to the environment.
This one can be a little more tricky, but not in the way that people think it is. So part of this comes from a misconception about how well these plants would actually do in the environment. If you are growing plants in a field, those plants have been have been modified over generations of crossbreeding, of actual of farmers monkeying with what they wanted, but over a much larger number of genes. And the result is you've got this really domesticated crop that's not going to have an easy time getting out into the wild world of plants and growing successfully. And that's what it needs to do in order to pass on its genetics to those other crops. But there is always the concern that some amount of pollen could come from these plants and go to a different plant, and that plant could take on certain characteristics. It would have to be a very similar plant to it. It would also have to be a plant that the GMO would have to be capable of producing seed. There are some GMOs that are actually programmed to not produce seed, which causes its own problems, means that farmers keep having to buy the seed. It really sets up kind of a racket, but it's also meant to resolve this part of this problem. I think that there is some room for concern about that, but that concern has to be tempered a bit, because it's not like the new plant can pick and choose certain regions of the genome. It's going to randomly select some regions to crossbreed with, and it's not going to work out very well for the vast majority of plants.
All right. Next myth is that GMOs use more pesticides, and therefore they are more harmful to eat than pesticide-free or organic crops.
In the words of Willy Wonka, scratch that, reverse it. Nestleg, I'm pretty sure Terminator seeds have been developed. They actually have produced seeds that will, they have produced plants that will not seed, and as a result will not actually produce any seed in the process. It's part of the reason why many companies are actually hated for doing it, because it forces their customers to be continuously buying seed from them, like I was saying. But to this point, it's the other way around actually, because many of these crops produce their own internal amounts of, say, Bt toxin. You don't have to spray them with larger amounts of it, which would be the only way to make them effective. They can produce it at a much lower level in their actual tissues and be more effective as a result. So I would say that in this case, it depends what you're genetically modifying. But if you're genetically modifying to produce some kind of pesticide or herbicide, you need to use a whole lot less of those things in the field, and it goes away with the plant as opposed to being sprayed all over it. If you're talking about other GMOs like golden rice, then you're talking about an issue that has nothing to do with whether or not you're using pesticides or herbicides.
All right, sure. So let's go talk about organic crops and organic farming and how that compares to conventional farming. So what exactly is meant by organic farming? Because we see a lot of organic certifications in the supermarkets. What exactly does that mean?
So the, one of the most important things to recognize first is that not every organic label means the same thing. There are actually sort of a gradient of organic labels where they can say like 100% organic or very varying levels of organic, and that's where things get a little choppy. That certain aspects of what it takes to be organic don't necessarily hold up across all products labeled organic. That being said, they're usually non-GMO. They usually involve some reduction or complete removal of things that are more synthetically produced, so synthetic pesticides or herbicides or fertilizers. You must use what would be called the organic, so something that could actually supposedly at least degrade in nature, that isn't produced from a chemical source or isn't produced synthetically in a lab.
All right, sure. So what is usually quote unquote safer? Would a organic pesticide be safer than a synthetic pesticide, or would the opposite be true? We see that
It,
claim being bounced back and forth quite a lot.
it's not necessarily either way. There are, if you ingest enough of of a synthetic herbicide, that could be dangerous to your health. If you ingest enough of an organic herbicide, the same could be true. It depends on which one you're dealing with, and it depends on its actual profile. That being said, there's been a lot more research into the synthetic ones. The organic ones are getting there. They're getting to the point that you can actually make those kinds of comparisons more accurately.
So basically, it goes by the old axiom: the dose is what makes the poison.
I'm sorry, say that again.
So it's basically the old axiom: it's the dose that makes the poison.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So it matters how much you're spraying, how much you're using in the field, and how much people are eating as a result. And that's really independent of synthetic versus organic.
All right. So, what type of GMOs are currently under development?
I am not super familiar with the up to date varieties. I know in I know for certain crops, especially things like bananas, there's been a push for changes to the way that those to what varieties we have out there. Part of the problem there is that you have this huge amount of bananas that are grown everywhere that are basically part of the same family. And if you don't spread the genes apart, things tend to get bad pretty quick. In this case, it means that there are viruses and fungi that are attacking these bananas that can rip through them, regardless of what people are saying that they're growing. They're always going to be. I'm trying to remember the term for this, but it's like a monoculture of these bananas. So there's lots of efforts to introduce a given resistance gene into these bananas, into this banana monoculture, that will actually provide it some protection. And it becomes a bit of an arms race at that point, because then you're dealing with, okay, well, what else could come up? You want to have a mix of not just, we're going to use more GMOs that can effectively prevent a lot of these diseases, but we also want to try out different types of banana, make sure that in doing so we afford more protection. Also, growing multiple different plants in the same field can help with that in some ways.
All right, and this leads me to another myth that you often see is that GMOs will eventually cause superbugs and super diseases that would be nearly impossible to control using standard or even organic pesticides.
Again, that seems to be relatively non-unique, as the case may be. It's going to happen because we are engaged in an arms race with bacteria, viruses, and fungi, which will all mutate and adapt much faster than we can. So we want to find ways to prevent them and do something about them. I think the best way to do that is to create organisms that can actually protect themselves, as opposed to trying to find ways to protect them by spraying them and providing outside means. So giving them internal means to actually prevent and address these infections probably provides a greater degree of protection that lasts a little longer. But it's true, we will eventually have superbugs. Things will that war will eventually lead to bad things. It's just not GMO specific. Any kind of grower
Right.
will face that.
So in a way, the GMOs are better because you are eventually going to not have to use as much pesticides and pretty much drench the entire field with pesticides in order to get a profitable yield, because the plants will be able to create their own immunity to these viruses and bacteria, correct?
Yeah, and going a little further on that, uh, suppose that you are comparing a field that is addressed with GMO crops versus one that gets herbicides and pesticides. What the difference between the two is one really crucial factor: weeds. There are tons of weeds in both fields, but the weeds are getting the herbicides and pesticides in one field, and they're not in the GMO field. And that's an important difference, because if these weeds are getting those herbicides and pesticides, then they're also subject to the same strains that other organisms could be. So that's how you get herbicide resistant weeds. That's how you get pesticide resistance from insects, because they're able to move on to other plants. Because they're constantly under the same stress all over the field. You don't give them another target to choose, and so effectively you're furthering that arms race by doing more in terms of pesticides and herbicides.
All right, sure. So, is there any other topic you feel like we should discuss regarding GMOs and pesticides and organic crops?
So I mean, there's a lot of genetic modification technology out there that could be part of this discussion. CRISPR, in particular, has been rather important to the development of new genetic modifications because we can be much more specific and targeted in modifying genes. We can cut things out and replace them, though there's some discussion as to whether or not the removal of a gene is actually falls under genetic modification. I know there's been a lot of disagreement on that front. So if you don't know about CRISPR, it's the CRISPR is basically a set of repeats taken of a given sequence. So if I decide I want to target a given gene, I'll give it what's called a guide RNA. I'll introduce the guide RNA with something called Cas9. Cas9 will see that guide RNA, chop it up into pieces to give this set of repeats, and use that as a template to target similar sequences in the actual plant or whatever host you have. And so in this case, CRISPR is capable of finding those sequences much more specifically than a lot of other different methods, and we can introduce it by the same method with agrobacterium.
All right, very cool. Let's see here. GMOs are. I just wanted to take a look at the Cyber chat to see if we have any questions or comments here.
I can go through some of what Nestle has been saying.
Yeah, feel free to go through and see if you have anything you want to respond to.
So I guess I'm not understanding what you mean by a terminator seed then, Nestle. What do you mean by a terminator seed?
Right. Sure. So, what exactly is meant in when it's talked about GMOs? What is generally defined as a terminator seed?
So my experience with terminator seeds are that they grow a plant, but that plant doesn't produce seed. And so it's effectively sterile in the process. I had thought that was the I was working with that definition of terminator. So he seems to acknowledge that sterile plants exist, but
Right.
not that terminators exist. I'm pretty sure a terminator is just a programmed sterile organism.
Right. So, wouldn't a seedless watermelon be considered a terminator seed in that case
Yeah.
as well?
Yeah, it would.
Right. And sure. So, any other topics that you want to talk about regarding GMOs before we move on to a different topic?
We'll get through the rest of his questions first. Let's see. I don't really understand this point about GMO being arbitrary anyway. I guess this is one thing I wanted to discuss. So it's important to recognize that what is and is not genetically modified does have some wiggle room here. What we think of as genetically modified, what's talked about as genetically modified, is essentially grabbing or modifying or introducing a given sequence into a plant. And usually we're talking about a very small number of genes, a very, very well restricted number of genes. If we're talking about but that's not the only means of genetic modification. And I think this is what Nestle is getting at, that genetic modification has been going on since we started working with plants at all. We crossbreed all the time. We get all these genetically modified plants as a result, but we're changing countless genes in the process of doing this crossbreeding. We're just selecting for a given trait that we want to have by crossbreeding between a plant with that trait and a plant without that trait. There are also other ways to do it, some that go a little bigger and some that go a little smaller. In terms of bigger, there are many examples of plants that have been genetically modified by exposing them to chemicals or radiation. That ends up doing a lot of DNA damage and changing, and in the process of repairing itself, the plant makes a lot of changes as a result. So you can do that radiation by X-ray or gamma rays, but it produces some pretty massive changes in the plant that can also result in genetic modification. And then the last one that I might talk about is something called RNAi, which is another targeted method that's meant to focus on more short-term changes as well. You essentially introduce a short RNA sequence that gets picked up by certain plant proteins and targets those sequences. It's usually meant to knock down expression of genes rather than knock out genes entirely.
All right. That's pretty cool. So, this here, that's like a Terminator seed is here a little bit by genetic modification. So it looks like what do you see? From what I understand, what he's saying is that um, I think seedless watermelons were created through artificial selection, and Terminator seeds would be deliberately genetically modified in the germline. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think that's what
Okay.
Nestle is trying to say.
This just seems like semantics. I think we're agreed on the basic fact that you can make something, you can effectively program something to not produce seeds. He's talking about different methods to do that. I don't know all the specifics on that, so he might be talking about this a little more knowledgeably than I can. But the fact remains that genetic modification can include ways to knock out seed production.
All right, cool. So, any other topics that you want to talk about?
So let's see. Well, so I guess just a couple of things I could show. Let's see, I can share my screen, right?
Oh, absolutely. Go right ahead.
So let me just get this up real quick. So this is probably one of the better infographics I've seen with regards to showing the differences between the kinds of genetic modification. Um, so can you see this? How crops are genetically modified?
Yeah, I can. Let me make that a little bit bigger for you guys.
So this is, and this may be the point that he's making, is that all of these technically fall under what is genetically modified, even if this transgenics is really the only thing that is treated as GMO. That's what we recognize as GMO. Really, all of this is GMO. We just recognize traditional breeding very differently than we recognize transgenics. And so you end up with traditional breeding for almost all crops that encompasses tens of thousands to over 300,000 base pairs of DNA. Mutagenesis, which is what I was talking about with chemicals and radiation. This is actually how we got things like popcorn as well. There's no way to know just how many genes we modify here, but it can be a ridiculous number. RNA interference, that's that RNAi switching off certain genes for certain length of time. It's not a permanent shift, but it can affect a very small number of genes. And transgenics are very much this specific targeted process as well. Okay. So to Nestle's point, he's saying, do you want to share this quote he has on CRISPR?
Hold on,
So he
there we
says,
go. The
yeah,
CRISPR
he
thing has
says,
revealed this as well. In Europe, in order to make CRISPR count as GMO, they also had to say that mutagenesis is GMO, but they arbitrarily exempted mutagenesis anyway. And that is why I say that GMO is an arbitrary category. And it's also the case that all crops, scratch that, all organisms are transgenic. And in a way, he's correct. And all of us have been genetically modified. That's pretty much all what evolution is, genetically modified from our ancestors. I'm not a carbon copy of what my parents were, and so forth.
That's certainly true. I would say that when we're talking about transgenic organisms, we're talking about having imposed some pressure to change them. And so in that way, I'd say that humans have certainly been through that at some point in our history. Whether we still do is up for debate. There's certainly room to argue that. I would generally agree, though, that the way that we designate what is and is not GMO has been relatively arbitrary, and it's an effort to view certain things as the right way to produce a new crop versus the wrong way. And in that respect, I've never really understood why just classical crossbreeding is somehow right, despite not knowing just how many genes you're dragging along for the ride, whereas individual transgenic introductions are somehow this terrifying Frankenstein food, as it's been called.
Right. And of course, that's just simply not the case.
Yeah, but yeah, I think that's a good point, Nestleg. I think we're on the same page about this.
Yeah, definitely. And I would also agree with you there. Sure. So let me pull up. I had a couple as well. Um, oh, this is a good one. I forgot to put this in one of our myths. Is that GMOs cause cancer?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
I have heard
And
that
you
one
seen
before.
and you seen those scary memes with the pictures of mice with large tumors after consuming the GMO stuff, and it's all out there. So, do GMO crops cause cancer?
Uh, there is no data supporting that conclusion. And we actually have very large, admittedly, what we're dealing with in this case is more correlative data. But if we're looking at populations that eat large amounts of GMOs, the US is particularly well known for doing lots of it, whereas a lot of Europe bans GMO crops, and you therefore have two populations that are eating a lot of the same things, but one is more GMO and one is less. You don't see any increased incidence of any kinds of cancers associated with one population versus the other. And as for the studies in mice and rats, I've heard it said before that if we could if we could cure cancer at the same rate that we do in mice and rats, it wouldn't be a problem in humans. And in particular, a lot of these studies are plagued by lack of effective controls and a big problem, which is that they tend to use mice that are prone to cancer. And so if you don't have an effective control group for that, it can be hard to tell the difference when all of a sudden everyone starts getting tumors, and they make these big claims as a result of that.
Yep. That's like Frankenfood is ironic too. The only thing that is actually like transgenic is grafting, stitching plants together. We have done this for millennia, and it actually causes transgenesis.
Yes, it's also very important for treatment of certain diseases in plants. If you don't do that, you don't get the effectiveness. And if you go out to some orchards, all the trees you'll see will be grafted. They'll have stumps that look distinctly different from the rest of the tree. And it's because that's how we've actually made made it possible to produce them in to produce certain fruits and vegetables in large numbers, is to do this kind of grafting. So I'd agree that is more Frankenfood, but it's definitely also got nothing to do with genetic modification.
Okay, so on that note, pretty similar. Do GMO crops have any impact on bees or butterflies? Because we do know that the bee population is on the decline, which is causing concern among scientists. And so there seems to be a correlation between increase of GMOs and a decline of bees and butterflies. Is there any evidence to support that assertion?
So again, it's in this case, the correlation has a weak, if any, link to actual causation. So there is always a concern that in using lots of pesticides, we are going to kill off good insects, bees, butterflies, pollinators, that kind of thing. And there's room to argue that our pesticides are doing that, and therefore that genetic modification is introducing more crops with more pesticides. The difficulty is, and this comes back to our issue of using more pesticides, you use a lot more at a lot higher concentration when you are spraying your crops than you do in these plants that are just producing it internally. The other important thing is these pollinators aren't picking it up in the same way that that the insects that are attacking these plants would. Insects that are attacking these plants would eat some of it and pick up some of the actual harmful Bt toxin or whatever else is in these plants. A pollinator isn't going to pick it up from the pollen in the same way that one of these pests might from actually trying to destroy the crop, actually trying to eat it. In the meantime, they're both going to be equally exposed to droplets of pesticide that exist on the outside of these plants. So again, the benefit is having it internal to the plant so that it doesn't affect as many of these pollinators that are just experiencing these plants for shorter periods of time and aren't actively getting huge doses of whatever pesticide is being produced in these plants.
All right. So, so I guess a better question first is, how are GMO crops tested for safety for consumption, and what long-term effects have there been, if any? And before we continue, Nestlink says, love this talk. This is also my education. I inserted a gene that made a tobacco plant red using Argobacterium as a class project. That is really awesome.
So,
Thank you very much.
there are a couple of genetic modifications that will do that. I don't know if you worked with the same one I did, which is M. cherry, but I definitely tried to get some organisms to express M. cherry and had issues on my end actually. But this was when I was an undergrad. Uh, in my case, I was trying to express a full-on virus, which I eventually got to do, and the satellite RNA, which was associated with it. So but a lot of people do like to express various fluorescent proteins, which can actually highlight certain processes in the plant and make it possible for us to see how they work. It's a lot of how we discovered how things are trafficked in plant and human cells. I think it's absolutely fascinating. And it's great that you got to do that kind of insertion as part of your class project. My guess is you used a tobacco plant called Nicotiana benthamiana, which happens to be very amenable to genetic transformation. Some others can do it too, but that one's particularly good. So back to David's question. The actually, could you summarize it real quick? Just so I
Sure.
don't.
So, how are these crops tested for the safety of human consumption, and what long-term effects have there been?
So there's a lot of testing that's done in very isolated systems. Like they're not growing the first stages of GMO crops that are brand new and have never been tested in an open field, which I think is what a lot of people think is happening. They're grown within a very closed off environment, usually within greenhouses, and tested extensively to see whether other genetic modifications have been made. So if they should be finding only one genetic modification. They might find that there are many, and there's a lot of different sequencing methods to do that. They also want to make sure it's not disrupting any important genes, because if you have a gene that you want and it's inserted in such a way as to block another gene, that can cause a lot of problems too. So there's a lot of processes that they go through to try and analyze what the gene is in silico and see whether it's likely to cause any problems. Then there's a lot of extensive testing, usually done through the USDA and FDA, to determine whether it's actually safe for human consumption. And those will be done on small scales. There will be a lot of testing on that level too. And generally, there's even a good deal of testing of how well these genes spread outside the plant. So they'll grow it in these contained facilities and see if it spreads outside of those plants. That being said, there's always going to be some spread of genes. Roundup ready crops from Monsanto, for example, can have been known to jump to other fields and be found in the wrong place, which can yield its own problems. There's a lot of issues with how GMO crops are actually marketed and how and how much litigation goes into keeping them keeping them in the pocket of those companies. But I'm not going to get too deep into that.
Yeah. So actually, this puts into a very interesting section. I'm glad you brought up Roundup because there is a lot of disinformation about Roundup. The active ingredient, I believe, is glyphosate,
Mhm.
and Roundup is not the only pesticide on the market that has glyphosate in it. For some reason, it's only Roundup that gets all the hate. Um, and I think I saw a story about Roundup eventually being pulled from the markets and some issues with people claiming that Roundup is causing cancer. What is the evidence to support or refute those claims?
That one's a little trickier. There's a lot of conflicting evidence surrounding glyphosate, and when it comes to actual treatments in terms of herbicides and pesticides, that one's definitely lower on the scale in terms of actual harm that it causes to other organisms, including humans. But there's a lot of there is enough evidence that people are at least concerned about it. I can't say that it's been strongly proven, and even where I have seen decent evidence of it, the dose seems incredibly high. And so certain things are bound to happen when you increase the dose to ridiculous degrees. So I guess the main issue is that it's become this kind of thing where there are so many weeds that are picking up Roundup resistance that Monsanto is pushing for more people to use more Roundup to take care of them. And so as you add more Roundup to these fields, you increase those concentrations. And that's where things can get bad. I wouldn't say that glyphosate is in and of itself at normal use levels too dangerous, though it certainly could be. There's some evidence to that, even if it's conflicted. At higher levels, it can definitely be a problem.
Right. So, with that, is there any other topic that you want to cover?
Well, let me see. Uh, yeah, I know that Nestle brought up this topic in the chat, and I think it's just something interesting to note about plants in general. polyploidy. He brought up triploidy in particular, and so this is one of those. This is actually something really interesting about plants. When you think about most uh, ploidies, you're thinking about haploid or diploid. So haploid is our gametes, the sperm and ovum. They're actually haploid. They have one copy of each of the uh, chromosomes, the unique chromosomes in our bodies. Our bodies are mostly diploid. We have 46 chromosomes, which means we have two copies of every single chromosome. Some ploidies for actual plants, especially rice, reach up to ridiculous extremes. I think I've heard like of as many as 11 ploidy in some rice. And so that makes for a lot of genetic diversity because there's a lot of ability for certain chromosomes to change and for it to test the waters with those. And if it's a problem, they've got tons of other copies of the same thing. There's also some other forms of changing genes that involve things like protoplasts. Uh, they're they're basically the some really isolated plant testing that you can do, and you can modify on a single cell level, which gets into some really interesting territory. And then there's some other things like transgenesis, which I don't know a whole lot about, that involves similar ability to modify genes on a very localized level. In this case, using some viruses to do that.
Yeah, and let's like put a couple good comments here. All I have to complain about is when they want to ban glyphosate since it's type 2A carcinogen, when they drink alcohol, a type 1A carcinogen or 2B.
Yeah.
But yeah,
So this is
so yeah,
definitely go ahead. Go ahead.
so, so yeah, tobacco and alcohol are far more carcinogenic than say glyphosate. And that would
It's
and just going on a rant, there's what one of the things that really bothers me about California's Prop 65 is that it's on pretty much everything. Um, and you know it's bad when there's a big old Prop 65 sign in Disneyland um, in California. So it's not really much to say, okay, something is carcinogenic. That really doesn't tell us much about the safety of a particular product, especially since the sun itself is carcinogenic.
yeah, and so to your and Nestleg's point, there is a certain amount of accepted risk that we take with having things in our society. Alcohol, as he brought up, the sun is of course something that we have to deal with all the time. And the one of the important things to keep in mind when you're dealing with glyphosate and comparing harms and everything, you're not comparing between glyphosate and nothing. You're comparing between glyphosate and whatever we replace glyphosate with. You can't get rid of herbicides as a whole. They're going to be here. So it's a question of what is the herbicide with the least risk to humans. And I think on that level, glyphosate has a relatively strong claim. It's certainly not perfect, but to say that any herbicide would be perfectly healthy for humans is a bit of a problematic statement.
Yep. And yeah, and I was just looking up. It looks like I just want to double check just to be certain. So IARC is probably carcinogenic to humans. That's 2A. Um, and that's with high temperature frying steroids and certain red meats that are also the same level of classification as glyphosate. So I really like what you said there about, okay, we have to compare this to what's going to replace it and um, all the other stuff as well that is also carcinogenic. So it's not really enough to say, okay, this could cause cancer. to say, okay, this did cause cancer and therefore should be pulled from the market.
Yep, I agree. I'm going to share one more screen just because I think this is a good comparison of the available. Uh, Let me get that up real quick. So it's a good comparison of the available pesticides out there. Most of what we would talk about are these chemical pesticides, and there's a great deal of biopesticides out there. These are some of the things that might appear in organic farming and be used in a lot of different forms. Obviously, not genetically modified stuff, but that's just another example of the way that genetic modification can affect so much of what we do. We can actually create specialized pesticides through the process of genetic modification, and some are even things that are naturally occurring in plants. There's actually some really interesting research that's been done into volatiles produced by plants, which include some pesticides, but they are also ways to detect whether a plant is infected or under attack by a lot of different parasites. And I think they're fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. So, any other final topics you want to cover before we say it all for the night?
No, I think that's about all I had.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for joining me, and thank you, Dr. Pollack, for joining me as well. What's coming up? I have a show on homeopathy this Friday at 9 p.m., and that will be with Jordan, aka Reason to Doubt. We're going to be exploring whether or not um, homeopathy is scientific, and if it is not, what the harms come from homeopathy. And on Saturday at 3 p.m., I have a former Answers Genesis employee. We're going to be talking about their experience working there. And at 9:15 p.m. on Saturday, I have a very special stream with a very special guest, and you definitely do not want to miss that. And I am going to be keeping that a top secret until Friday. And so please feel free to hit that subscribe button and that bell notification and that like button down below so you can be notified whenever I go live. And if you like what we're doing and you want to support this channel, my Venmo, PayPal, and my brand new Patreon are in the description down below. So thank you everyone for your support. Thank you for watching and have a wonderful evening. I am out.
Thank you.